Great. So we have another guest with us today. We have Alexis Rendell. He is a tea importer and tea blender based in the UK. He's the founder of Tea Mountain, and he imports tea from China, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka. And previously, he used to work as an illustrator and designer. So great to have you on the show, Alexis. Thank you so much for joining.
Pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. So why don't you please tell us a little bit about your journey? You were working as a designer, then you transitioned into running Tea Mountain. So
yeah, it's a pretty long story actually, but I'll give you the shorter version. As you say, I started off as a illustrator and designer. Then I got a job. Luckily, I got a job with a big publishing house which produced magazines globally. I started off as a junior designer there, and over the next 25 years with the same company, I've progressed through the ranks and ended up being head of global production, looking after teams around the world, from Manila, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Singapore, London, Houston, New York, and other people in between as well. And so that team consisted of designers, print designers, web designers, copy editors, translators, and production people.
lovely. So how was the transition from being an illustrator for such a long time, having such a great, amazing career, to now in the tea business? How was the transition?
Okay, so what happened was, as part of my remit, when the company I worked for took on new companies, whether through acquisition or they were setting it up in another country or something, I was generally sent out to try and integrate those teams or try and grow the teams. And in this instance, when they acquired a company in 2009 in China, I was duly sent out there, and I spent a fair amount of time in China. Now, I love tea. I have always loved tea, and I thought I knew a bit about tea until I got to China, and I realized that I absolutely knew nothing in comparison to what even the people in the office were drinking. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It was just, they knew about where it was grown, they knew about the leaf, everything, which I just found astounding. Now, in the UK, if you work in an office, you usually have a kettle, a tin of coffee, and a box of tea. In the China office, every single person brought in their own blend of tea, and they're all drinking different teas. And there was even, went out for lunch in a place across the street. They had a tea menu. In the UK, you'd have a wine menu. There, they had a tea menu, and it was something like 16 pages of all these different teas. And I got through probably about half of those in the time that I was there. And I just found it fascinating. And what happened was, because I was out there for a considerable time, I was at the weekends, instead of just sitting, in my apartment and watching videos or playing games or whatever, I was actually going out and looking at places. And what happened was, round about, getting on for about a month into my stint there, one of the people in the office said, "Oh, what are you up to this weekend?" Because they'd all got to know that I was going out and seeing all these amazing places.
Right.
And basically, she said, "Well, do you want to go to a tea market? I've heard you like tea and all the rest of it." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds brilliant." I said, "But I don't know about this Chinese tea." She said, "It's okay. My husband, he's a tea trader, and he can show you around and he can teach you about this stuff." She said, "And I can be the translator for you." And literally that Saturday, I spent the whole day at this tea market, tasting some pretty amazing teas, it has to be said. And also the differentiation between what is perceived to be a cheap tea compared to an expensive tea. And this was done by pouring 2 cups of tea and being asked to taste it. They looked almost identical. The taste was somewhat different. One was much more subtle and a bit richer. And then he said, "Well, one of those is $10 for 10 grams, and the other one is $180 for 10 grams. Which one's which?" And I'm glad to say I got it right. And what it was actually was a boiled oolong tea. But anyway, and he says, "Yeah, you've got a good taste." Cut to end of 2018, and I left that company and to go it alone. And I was doing quite well with my business until lockdown, till COVID. And I had just started working with a business coach at the time. And I got through the first year okay, but then it got to the second year when things were starting to lift and business was returning to normal. And he said, right, let's get your business going. And I said, actually, I don't know if I want to do what I was doing. I want to do something different. And he said to me, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't know. And literally over the next 6 weeks, he gave me some really simple advice. He said, just get a piece of paper, 3 columns. The first column, everything that you're passionate about. The middle column, everything that you're good at doing. And we'll take something from column A, combine it with column B, and we'll get a business for you in column C. And that's how the tea business was born, because I love tea. And I had lots of contacts over the 10 years that I was working with people in China. I'd actually built up a good supply network. And yeah, the rest is history, really. So I launched my business, 2021. My tea business in 2021.
That's a fantastic story. But I am not a tea drinker. I very rarely, like once in probably 6 months, I would drink tea, right? So please educate me a little bit about it. There's just one type of tea that I've tasted so far. So please educate me about tea as a subject.
Okay, well, so at the very basic level, there are 6 types of tea. So you've got your green tea, white tea, yellow tea, black tea, oolong, and then there's a very specialist one called pu'er, and that's a fermented tea. Now, the Chinese have been drinking tea for around 5,000 years. The rest of the world, not so long. So, for example, commercial tea growing arrived in India around about sort of 1840s. I think it was before then, but it wasn't commercialized until the 1840s. So that gives you some idea of how advanced they were in the cultivation and the different types of tea. Now, all tea comes from the same plant. And with that, it's Camellia sinensis. Now, there's a sub variety that grows in northeast India, Camellia sinensis assamica, and that's the big leaf. That's kind of where we get a lot of our black teas from now. But that also grows in certain areas in China, also. But put simply, anything you can say when you're describing wine, you can say about tea. So it's all to do with the terroir, the person that's grown it, the amount of sunlight it gets, the drainage, how high above sea level, all of those things. As I say, everything you say about wine, you could say about tea. It's interchangeable.
Got it. And so when you go about choosing what tea to import, how do you go about doing that? How do you know which tea is which, and how big the market is for that tea? What's the thought process behind it?
Well, so the ethos of how I do things is that it's ethically sourced and sustainably grown. All my packaging is either biodegradable or recyclable. It's plastic free. And so I try and help the communities where it's grown. I think I may have mentioned to you before, but for example, a good example is in Nepal itself, where there's I'm working with some 3rd generation tea growers. I think it's about 5 different families originally who were kind of all separate farmers. They're all doing their own thing, and they weren't doing very well. The tea was excellent, but what they did was, this current generation, 3rd generation, they pooled their resources, they created a cooperative, and now all the money that they make goes back into the community. So building schools, upgrading the buildings and the roads and things like that.
Wow.
And that's the kind of companies I work with. So when I source the teas from small holdings, basically. there are some massive commercial plantations, tea gardens out there in the world. I generally avoid those because, well, another reason is that the scale that they want to sell on is way beyond my means at the moment. I mean, my business is 2 years old. It's still pretty small. And I find that the smaller companies are, they reciprocate. I help them, they help me. But the other thing is, when in terms of choosing the tea, it's purely from a selfish point of view. If I like it, I'll sell it.
I think that's the best way to do that. Go about
Yeah.
doing that. Totally. Okay, all right. So you were for a large part, like you had mentioned, for a very long time, you were in the illustration and designing business, right? And then you
Yeah.
transitioned into the tea business, even though you had liking for the tea and you had good taste for it. But I am sure starting a business in a completely different market comes with its own set of challenges, right? So if you could walk us through all the challenges that you had to go through and how you went about dealing with those challenges.
Yeah, and that's a good question, actually, because I think that the challenges I faced would face pretty much any new startup, and that's getting your name known out there. It's getting people to know about what it is you do, how good you are, do you know what you're talking about? And as I say, I was lucky to have a really good business coach who could help guide me on this route. And I would recommend that anybody gets a good business coach when it comes to that, because they're worth their weight in gold. Think of the best way that I think of it is, think of a football team without a coach. They will just go out there, do their own thing. They know, it's like, some of these Sunday teams, local amateur teams.
Yeah.
They all know how to play football. They know the rules. They all go out there, but they're all doing their own thing.
Right.
A coach guides you into a strategy, a focus, a plan, all of these things. So that being my number one tip. The second thing is getting your name known. Now, whether that's through networking, whether that's through LinkedIn, just slowly building up your credentials, really, so people know about you. And thirdly is actually getting out there and doing it. So as well as doing the first two, well, for me, it was a case of knocking on doors, hotels, restaurants, cafes, that kind of thing, in whatever market that you decide to go into. Do the same thing. And consistency and persistency are my two key things.
Right. Great. So especially when you were starting out, what was the kind of pitch you had to the people you were meeting and talking about your business?
Pretty much what I've said already, actually. It's to differentiate myself. I was aiming at a local market, so I had created a blend of tea which was specific for the local market. I was lucky that there is some historical aspect around that as well. So I'm based in Portsmouth, and tea was first. The person that's credited with making tea popular in the UK arrived in Portsmouth, and she introduced tea, and people didn't know what it was, and so that was a good thing. I could talk about the history. The second thing is talk about the things I've spoken about already. The ethical, sustainable aspects of it, and it's helping small businesses around the world, basically. And it tastes good, and that's the three things. And then what I would do is encourage them to sample the tea, and usually once people have sampled it, they like it, and there you go.
Got it. Cool. So now that is how you started initially. How has your marketing strategy evolved over a period of time?
Yeah, so I haven't been going for that long, so I'm just coming to the end of my second year in business. First year, it was pretty much all word of mouth by networking and knocking on doors, as I say. This year, I've got a fledgling website. I've started working with a social media company who are having some good results on that as well. Wow. I'm now starting to advertise. I've joined a couple of organizations which are pertinent to my industry. So I work with them as well and help to promote my business that way. Eventually I see that in the future I'm going to expand more about my online presence, my online presence, and just carry on that way, really.
Great, great. So now in this entire process of importing tea, how do you ensure that the quality does not get compromised? How do you make sure that the quality stays consistent all the time?
That's a really good question. So far, I've been lucky. So when I've sourced it, I've always asked for samples in advance. The samples have been pretty good, and there's always the worry that they're going to send you the really good stuff, and then you buy more, and then it's actually not so good. But again, it's the kind of people you're working with. Their reputation is everything. If they get a bad reputation, I'm going to tell other people about it. And so they want to be seen to be producing good tea as well. So far, so good.
Great. So could you please tell us a little bit about your target audience and what are their tea preferences?
Okay.
Yeah.
So interesting. So one thing I found fairly early on when I was talking to the hospitality industry is that they wanted tea bags. Now I was only offering loose leaf tea, so I had to find somebody that could put the tea into the tea bags.
Correct.
So that took a bit of time, and that's all happening now. So that's one market. So the hospitality industry are very specific about what they want, and cost is obviously paramount for them because they need to sell it on. Where I'm now exploring is, and this is where the website is coming in and the social media, is the single source, single estate teas, which are very very high quality. So they're not blended teas. It's again, it's like a wine. A tea from, I don't know, from China grown this year will potentially be, not potentially, will be different to one which was grown at the same time last year or next year.
Okay.
And that's why you have blended teas, just to keep the taste the same over the whole amount of time. Whereas the single source, single estate, once it's gone, it's gone. You're not going to get that back. So that's a different market. That's a much more refined market, and that's something which it's challenging at the moment. It's a bit more difficult to get my name known out there, but I'll get there one day.
Great. Got it. Cool. And so if somebody is thinking about starting a business in this niche, what would you suggest them and how would you go about especially starting it and procuring material, understanding and getting a good taste of the tea? How would you guide them through this?
It would be it depends on their background, actually. So if they don't know much about tea, it's to go on something like the UK Tea Academy and do their courses, because they give you a thorough grounding in all things tea, but you also get to taste some amazing teas. And then you could possibly follow up. If you know a certain style, you can then start looking for that kind of style of tea. And that's how I'd recommend it.
Got it. Now talking about growing the business, I'm sure you must be partnering up with a lot of other ventures. Like you mentioned, the hospitality business. What other businesses are there which you look forward to partnering up with, and how do you go about reaching out to them?
Well, at the moment, what I'm also doing, so at this time of year particularly, using my design background, I put branded messages and logos and things on the boxes. So for corporate gifting and things like that. So for a Christmas gift to staff or clients, I can do that. That's a big growth area for me at the moment, and that's something which is keeping me busy.
Great. So what are your plans on expanding this business now? These are a few things that you're already doing. What do you plan on doing next to grow the business?
Is launching some new blends of tea. in different areas. And it's partnering with other organizations as well. So I'm currently working with some hamper companies. So it's just trying to find a good level of hamper company, that kind of thing, really. It's in terms of I want to get a couple of my brands into the big sort of supermarket type things. That would be brilliant. That's my ambition.
Lovely. So I am sure that even though the tea business has been there for a very long time, I am sure that there must be some kind of trend in the business. Some teas might get more preferred relative to the other teas. So how do you go about figuring out what the trend is and capitalizing on that, and maybe introducing a new trend as well?
Yeah, well, so in like any business out there, there's usually some trade magazines or trade newsletters that you can get online, and websites and things like that. So that's one source that I look at regularly. It's attending trade shows, so a tea conference or something like that, and actually understanding from some of the bigger companies and not so big companies about how they're succeeding, and just rubbing shoulders with other people in the tea business and hearing what's good out there.
Great. Yeah, so those were almost all the questions that I had. I have just one last question. So please tell us a little bit about your experience in BNI. How has it helped you? And are there any useful tips for people who are just joining in, and you could tell them how they could capitalize more on the BNI network?
Well, BNI for me has been amazing. I would say, when I said earlier about networking and face-to-face and referrals, 70% of that comes through BNI.
Wow.
And I'm in the fortunate position here on the south coast of the UK where I don't have any competition or much competition within BNI itself. So, as I'm sure it's probably the same where you are, if you can visit other chapters, you can get around and whatever, and as long as there's nobody else in the room. Now, I haven't yet come across another tea person in the room yet. So I get around quite a few. So in my quieter months, which is usually sort of February, March time, I will be doing 2 or 3 BNI meetings a week. I mean, my record is 5 in 1 week, but that was a big ask. But yeah, 2 or 3 different chapters in a week for a couple of months, and then maybe revisit each of those just to get your message across. And it's the 60 seconds. I can't overstate how important that is. Who you are, what is it you do, what's your USP, and what you're looking for. As long as you can do that, it's job done, really. As I say, it works for me.
I think that's a lovely insight, especially for those who are starting out. 70% of your business is coming from BNS. So I think that's a great news.
Yeah.
Please, if you could give us your 3 asks and 3 gives, and if somebody could help you with those, I think through the podcast, that would be a great output.
Okay, so as mentioned before, Alexis Rendell from Tea Mountain. I import, blend, and sell teas. The important bit here is I can put your messages onto packets of tea, boxes of tea, and it's a tasteful way to promote your company. I'm looking for any business right now that wants to plan ahead for Christmas to have something for their top staff, for their top customers, and have it a memorable way instead of a pen or a box of chocolates. Then give me a shout. I'm happy to have one-to-one with anybody that wants to have that. That's me, Alexis Rendell from Tea Mountain. And remember, life's like tea. It's all in how you make it.
Super. That was lovely. That was superb. Great. On that note, thanks a lot, Alexis. You were absolutely amazing. And I am sure anybody who's starting out a new business in this space would find this podcast super insightful. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks a lot.
No problem at all. Thanks very much.